In many democracies, voting is seen as a right that you can choose whether you want to exercise or not. However, in around 20 countries, it's actually a legal obligation. This system is known as compulsory voting, and whilst it differs from country to country, basically if you are eligible to vote, you have to turn up to the polling station. Let's go through 10 countries and explore why they have compulsory voting and what happens if you don't vote. The most popular and prominent one is Australia, and it is mandatory that you vote there, and you can be fined only around $20 Australian if you do not have a valid reason. This was introduced in 1924 after voter turnout dropped below 60%. Next we have Belgium. They do have compulsory voting, however it's not always enforced, so there are fines that are written into laws, however they're not always given out. This was introduced in 1893 to encourage a more broad democratic voting system. Next is Luxembourg, and they do give out fines. Luxembourg has a very strong civic voting culture, so this was mainly introduced to encourage that. Next we have Brazil, where it is mandatory for most people ages between 18 and 70. So rather than fines, citizens may encounter more administrative consequences such as not having access to certain documents, and even if you want to get a job in the public sector, you have to have a continuous voting history. This was introduced to encourage more universal participation. Next we have Peru, where voting is compulsory and fines are again written into laws. Again, this was introduced to encourage broad participation and for people to exercise their democratic rights. Next we have Uruguay, and they can impose fines on people that don't have a valid reason to not vote, and this was introduced to make sure that the government represents everyone. They want to make sure that the elected government does actually represent the majority of people. In Singapore, this is interesting. If you don't vote, your name is actually removed from the voting registry and you have to reapply again. This was introduced to encourage civic participation. Next, we have Argentina, which is similar to Brazil in the sense that it is mandatory for people between the ages of 18 and 70. They can impose fines, and also you can have administrative consequences for repeated non-voting. This was introduced in 1912 to broaden democratic participation. Next we have Bolivia, where if some citizens don't vote, they actually may struggle to access banking services and salary payments. And again, this is mainly to encourage more people to vote. And the last one for today is Ecuador. They have mandatory voting for anyone between the ages of 18 to 64, and fines can be imposed. This was introduced to maximise the turnout. There are a few other countries where voting laws do exist, however they're not regularly enforced. This includes countries such as Mexico, Costa Rica, Greece and Egypt. A lot of these countries have a voting turnout of around 85 to 90%. They want to encourage civic responsibility by treating voting as a duty, such as jury service or paying taxes. In a lot of cases, it can also reduce political equality, especially for sort of lower income communities who typically might not be able to vote. However, critics do argue that just because you can vote doesn't necessarily mean you should. If you are ill-informed or don't know enough, you could potentially vote for someone who is not aligned with your beliefs at all.